What does it take to change the energy system, and who is going to change it? There are lots of different technologies that can help us to move onto renewable energy rather than using fossil fuels to supply our energy. But we face really big challenges to get these technologies into action. The energy we use comes from systems that have been built over 100 years. A lot of money has already been spent on building and installing equipment to bring energy into use, whether that's gas pipes underground or electric cables, and all the bits of machinery that are used to manage electricity as it travels between the power station and our schools and homes. And money is often borrowed to build this equipment, and it may still be being paid off. So if there are ways to reuse it rather than finding more money to start again, then that's a more careful use of the Earth's resources. So all of these bits of equipment, pipes and cables, the transformers and switching stations, all the control rooms, as well as the organizations that run them, they're often referred to as infrastructure. So infrastructure is a system that helps other things happen. Lots of infrastructure is used to make and transport energy. So for example, there are pipes underground and cables that bring gas and electricity to our schools and homes and workplaces. And there are people who work on these energy systems to make sure that everything runs smoothly. And they have to abide by laws and follow rules to make sure that the equipment is used safely. And it takes a really long time to build new infrastructure. So we're not really ready yet to drop all of our existing energy sources and swap just to renewables. But every country is being encouraged to fully transition to renewable energy by no later than 2050, if not before. So who should build all this new infrastructure? Who should decide what to build? And who should say where it should go? Or which particular bits of technology should be chosen? Who will be in charge of all these different energy systems? Who will own them? Who will pay for them? These are the kind of questions we might be asking when we're thinking about how different countries can make the transition to renewable energy. So how do countries make decisions about energy, and how do they put them into action? What kind of challenges do they face? Let me give you a few examples. Norway, which is a very long and very mountainous Scandinavian country, gets nearly all of its electricity from hydroelectric power stations. That means the electricity is generated by water falling onto turbines and making them rotate so they can generate electrical currents. And throughout the last century, most of them were built by small communities along the coast to supply their villages and small towns. Gradually, they were brought into a national grid of power stations, but many small towns kept their own power so they could make decisions themselves about how much to generate and how much to charge for it. So Norway was lucky that its electricity, at least, was always renewable. But as the national grid expanded, especially in the 1980s, they needed to build bigger dams for more electricity. And they decided to build the largest ones in the far north, in the Arctic region. But by building really large dams in this area, they flooded the reindeer pastures and some of the most sacred sites for the Sami people who've lived in the north of the country for thousands of years. And there were many protests around the country, and including in the capital, including hunger strikes and big public protests. And eventually, the Norwegian king apologized, and the government allowed the Sami people to have their own parliament, and they're now consulted about building plans in their region. Now, in contrast, China is a one-party state, and decisions about development are made in principle by the government. Over the past 30 years, the Chinese government has moved a lot of people from the countryside into towns and cities that are incredibly large, and they need a lot of energy to keep going. They've also built a lot of factories that need energy too. So the Chinese government has had to build a lot of power stations very quickly And they particularly built a lot of coal-fired power stations to produce this energy because they're quite cheap to run. But this has caused terrible pollution, and many people have protested about it. So one of the big challenges for COP26 is persuading China to get rid of its coal power stations and use renewable sources of energy instead. At the same time, though, China's invested a lot of money into solar panel factories. And in the early 2000s, lots of Chinese companies were set up to make solar panels and sell them more cheaply than those produced in Europe and America. And this has made fantastically cheap solar panels available all around the world. Now, back in the 1950s, the United Kingdom had a central electricity generating board that was in charge of all of the country's power stations and electricity supply. They built lots of really big power stations and installed lots of cables to move the electricity around. Some of these cables are underground. Some are overhead power lines that you may have seen. And this network of cables is called the national grid, and it's still used to transport electricity to our homes and places of work today. In the 1980s, the Central Electricity Generating Board was broken down and sold into lots of smaller private companies. And there were advantages and disadvantages to this move. There are now lots of companies all selling electricity within the UK, and there's more choice of who you buy your electricity from. But these private companies all need to make a profit, so they won't invest in renewable technologies unless it's profitable for them to do so, or unless they're made to by the government introducing new laws. And the government won't introduce new laws that force the companies to use renewable technologies unless they believe that the people want them, because they want to be popular so that we'll vote for them again. So, in summary, your voice does matter. Showing that people really do want a sustainable future makes a difference, and it gives power to the politicians who also want to make changes. So the process might be a bit indirect and it might take time, but it can definitely happen.